Hi, this is the Reverend Andrew Christensen. You're listening to Doth Protest Too Much. We are a Christ-centered, reformationally minded podcast that explores the history and theology of the Christian Church. This podcast originally started as a forum for discussing the developmental history of Christian thought, what is often called historical theology. And it has since grown into an ecumenical team of hosts, myself, Stephen Burnett, Pastor Charlie Lehman, and the Reverend James Rickenbaker. We're all interested in the past, present, and future of the church. We share a commitment to the central place that grace has in the message of the good news, a message we feel often gets lost in our day and age, sometimes in religion itself. A message that is of God's goodwill toward us, as echoed in the following words from St. Paul. This is a true saying, and worthy of all men to be received, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the chief one. I pray that the discussions in our episodes, whether casual or scholarly, can speak to how the story and witness of Christians from our past can comfort and strengthen us for today. God bless. Hi, thanks for listening to Doth Protest Too Much, a podcast on Reformation theology and history. And this is Reverend Andrew Christensen, or Drew as I go by. And today I'm joined by Deaconess Ellie Corrow and also Dr. Bethany Kilcrease. Deaconess Ellie Corrow serves as missionary care coordinator for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod Office of International Mission. She serves on the board of Higher Things, which is a Lutheran ministry to youth and young adults. Ellie writes along with other guests, including Dr. Kilcrease, on their substack titled Lutheran Women on the Road, a blog and newsletter about loving God and loving neighbor and walking faithfully in this tension of Christian discipleship. I like that. Loving God and loving neighbor always sounds like good things to do on paper, but when rubber hits the road, as it often does every day, it's rather challenging and difficult for most of us, at least if we're normal, right? Well, I don't know what is normal. I guess we're all.
Indeed, it does.
If we're human, I should say, corrected to saying that. But I recommend our listeners to check it out. You can read them at Lutheress, LUTHERESS.substack.com. What's the meaning of Lutheress? Is that like...
That's a really great question. Should I do Reverend Christensen or Drew?
What's that?
Should I call you Reverend Christensen or Drew?
Just call me Drew. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I guess maybe as opposed to like deacon, it's deaconess. So it's like instead of
the rest. Yeah.
That I don't know.
It's like
I did not come up with that.
Yeah, we are actually not the brains behind that whole thing. Another wonderful Lutheran woman who's kind of pulled a bunch of women together and said, let's try and write stuff. And she titled the blog, and I'm sure she's got a very, very good, thoughtful reason that
I'm sure she does.
I just don't happen to know.
And I believe that is Caitlin, who is in our group.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And she is thanks to Caitlin, she's going to share this episode, the recorded final product, through, I don't know if Lutheress, but she's going to be sharing it through the channel. So, and our other guest, Dr. Bethany Kilcrease, is a professor of history at Aquinas College in Michigan, where I'm originally from. So I'm from the east side of the state. She holds a Ph.D. in modern British history from Boston College. She specializes in British and European modern intellectual and religious history and teaches several courses on topics that fall under that there at Aquinas. And of course, she said, call her Bethany for the episode. So Bethany, you are perhaps overdue to be on our show. I just have a sense that you are an Anglophile.
I am an Anglophile, yeah. So, I'm a Lutheran. I'm born and bred Lutheran, and yet virtually none of my scholarship has to do with anything related to Lutheranism. So there have been a few touch points, but most of it does not. I specialize in Anglicanism, actual Anglo-Catholicism and English Roman Catholicism.
Yes. Which, as I said, you are long overdue to be on the show. Of course, you're probably more of an Anglophile than I am, even though I'm the Anglican here. And you're such a serious historian that this podcast, I mean, should have had on, because originally we were conceived of as a historical theology podcast. And in many ways, we still keep that angle as the primary way of going about how we explore these topics. But, and of course, Dr. Kilcrease may sound familiar to our listeners. We've had the other Dr. Kilcrease, of course, on the podcast.
Mr. Doctor. That's how we differentiate them for our students.
Mr. Doctor.
Because he's
nice.
Here. So he's Mr. Dr. Kilcrease, and I'm Mrs. Dr. Kilcrease. So sometimes they put that on papers.
They put that on papers?
They do, yeah.
Nice. Well, of course, this is Mrs. Doctor's first time, but Mr. Doctor's been on the podcast twice, including our very first episode, which since has been reposted, so it won't show up as the first if you go and scroll through our episodes. But the other Dr. Kilcrease, Bethany's lesser half, don't tell him I said that, but I'll edit that out. Came on for both an episode discussing Protestant scholasticism of the 17th century, and he did an episode on the Luther-Zwingli debate on the Eucharist. So, but Ellie and Bethany, I'm delighted to have you both on. So thank you for being here. So before we get into anything, I've talked with Bethany here and there, but by way of knowing Jack, like I mentioned, and being on social media together, but we don't know each other, Ellie, and I'm curious about your title of deaconess, what that entails, what led to this calling for you. I mean, I grew up Missouri Synod I was very young. I don't remember deaconesses, but what is that? What does it entail, and how did you get into that?
Yeah. Short answer is deaconesses typically serve alongside word and sacrament ministry as the servants of mercy within the church, and that can look all the different ways that mercy can look in the church. So there's deaconesses that serve in a wide variety of ways. We're theologically trained, and at the seminaries. And, trained to, bring those works of mercy to those in need, with, theological legs on that. So me specifically, I didn't grow up Lutheran. I actually didn't grow up in the church at all, but was an evangelical for a while and decided that I wanted to go to seminary. And I went to Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and got an MA in church history and an MA in theology, and kind of started out Southern Baptist and came out the other side Lutheran. And I think I'm probably the only person that's done that journey.
I didn't know that, Ellie, and I thought a lot about you, but I did not know you were Southern Baptist at one. I was Assemblies of God before that, so wow. I think I knew that, but I didn't know there was a hot minute when you were Southern Baptist.
Yeah, so I was Southern Baptist for a hot minute. And so came out the other side Lutheran and had, in the process started attending a Lutheran church, and pastor at home was like, because I was kind of like, I don't know what to do with myself now, because, I was thinking of ways to serve in the church, but didn't know exactly what that looked like for Lutherans. And he was like, have you heard about deaconesses? And had sort of hooked me up with the seminary in Fort Wayne that had just started a distance deaconess program. And so I went through their deaconess program as well to get MA number 3.
MA number 3. So it's like basically, it's like a doctorate.
I mean, it is, yeah.
It is not. It is not.
Not credentials me, because the 2 masters make a doctorate. And then she's got the 3rd one on top of it.
No. That's what I'm sitting here. It's like, why am I in this room?
In this room, I have no doctorate either, and we'll see. I may end up as an ABD, all but dissertation. I know so many clergy with ABDs. Anyway, so,
There's so many people with ABDs.
What's that?
There's a lot of people with ABDs. So,
There are lots of people. Yeah,
it's a very popular degree.
It is, right? Lots of things sound good in the beginning. But no, mine's going fine-ish. But so, I mean, that's great. I mean, I didn't know all that. That's really helpful background and kind of makes sense until like you definitely have something to weigh in and reading a book like the book we're going to be talking about by Beth Allison Barr. So each of you brings like a wealth and knowledge of experience. I'm sure we could talk about any number of a variety of things for an episode, and I'm all game for doing that again in the future. But the reason why why both y'all are here tonight is that you each wrote together a review, which was in part a critique of the best-selling book from Christian author Beth Allison Barr, and that book being titled "The Making of Biblical Womanhood: How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth." And of course, based on that title alone, we can imagine that this book deals with an issue that can be a controversial issue in the church. Mm-hmm. And judging by its title, its thesis is definitely making a claim, perhaps an indicting claim for one, and a prescriptive way forward. It's one of those kinds of books. It's not a dispassionate book by any means. Sure. Unlike some of the books we probably read, because especially having a scholarly streak, we tend to maybe read some dry, dispassionate stuff. But there were things y'all both liked about the book and things you both didn't like. Mm-hmm. And we'll get into the details of your review momentarily. But can you offer up kind of a sketch of the main argument of the book and what Barr was going for here? I mean, you do say, I do want to pull a quote from your review. You do say in your review of the book that, quote, her argument that biblical womanhood, which tells women they must be domestic, housebound, and married mothers at the expense of other vocations, is important and prophetic. As such, her book deserves to be widely read throughout the church. She demonstrates that the way we often read even the Bible through a patriarchal lens has led the church to discount the significance of named women in the Bible, including Mary Magdalene, Phoebe, and Junia. Moreover, the chapters on the history of women in the church during the Middle Ages and Reformation period are alone with the cost of admission. I may have misquoted that. Her chapter on the Reformation, for example, helps explain why Katharina von Bora, Luther, died impoverished. Her tragedy extended beyond an individual failure on the part of the church. Rather, it was a product of a newly constructed economic system that limited women's opportunities outside the home, unquote. So you found the value where it was to be found, as you saw it. But give us a sketch. What's it about? And yeah.
Sure. Well, Ellie, do you want me to
go for it, please?
Go. Sure.
Yeah.
Well, it's a really interesting book, like you say. And the interesting thing about it is that people bought it, for one, because it's by a woman who is a really profound and serious scholar, specializing in women's European history, mostly medieval English, early modern English history, and also church history. And like you say, those books they can be pretty dry, let's be real, and kind of jargon filled and stuff like that. And so what she's done here is she's combined some of her expertise in those areas with a lot of personal experience. Being a female professor at Baylor, where she is a historian. I think she was a dean for a little while too, although maybe don't quote me on that. And her experience as being the wife of a youth pastor, although I believe he is no longer. I think he's gone on to be a sole pastor now. Ellie's nodding her head, so I'm going to assume that's right. And so what she's done is she's taken arguments and some evidence that normally only the people who are used to slogging through really boring academic books would look at, and made it accessible both to those types, and brought a lot of different streams together, but also made it accessible to kind of the average pew sitter who might want to pick this up. And you can see that in the fact that, I mean, it's still, so this is I think like 21 months out since it's been published. And, I meant to look at the Amazon, it kind of, best, is this a top seller and whatever, but I bet if I did, it would still be up there pretty high.
I remember it being huge. I mean, Christianity Today ran articles.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, she was interviewed by NPR too, I think. Yeah. I mean, it hit mainstream, not even just mainstream Christianity, but I mean, like NPR and folks like that were really picking it up as well.
Right. Yeah, and that never happens to like medievalists, right? Right. It's really so I guess that's maybe the backstory to why this is a significant book and why it's kind of blown up in that way. I don't know, Ellie, if you want to jump in and say a little bit more about the book's argument.
Yeah, well, and she as Bethany was kind of saying, she kind of frames it around sort of her personal sort of story and journeying through a lot of this. So you kind of have this kind of back and forth where she'll have sort of an entry point of, I was doing the dishes one day and kind of had this thought, and then kind of her, historical / theological evaluation of kind of that thought, which makes it super accessible. And so she kind of straddles that really well in being a serious scholar, actually, and then, but creating something that anybody can pick up that to get a sense of some of these arguments, repackaged in a way that historians look at it and kind of recognize the arguments, and somebody who's totally unfamiliar with, I never knew that. That's really neat. So.
And I think it's important to know is that both of you are coming to this work from Barr from a certain perspective. You both are confessional Lutherans in a church body that has an understanding that sex or gender, which of course I know there is a distinction between the two, but I'm not going to go down the road of that. Our culture currently makes an awful lot of that distinction that I don't necessarily find helpful. But all this to say is that y'all's church body of LCMS has an understanding, especially in regard to ordained pastoral ministry, in the distinction from any ministry of a baptized person, that there are things that men are fit for or designed for, and things that women are fit for, meant for, designed for. And of course, in today's climate, once we even get into that type of discussion, the temperature can be raised a bit. But, I think we're all low temp here. James, a frequent co-host, who he recently preached at my installation service at the church I very recently have started serving as rector. And while he kept his focus on the gospel for the majority of the sermon, he did mention in the beginning how, he knows me and what our relationship is, what brought him to preach on this occasion. And he mentioned, Father Drew runs a podcast, and one of the great things he does on that is he brings people together. So I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, and he says he brings people together, even people with different views. And that's because I like that. I find the value in that. And as we all know, I just, as we talked in the pre-show, I serve an ordained ministry in the Episcopal Church, which has for several decades ordained women. This isn't true everywhere, as you know, in the Anglican Communion, but it is for us in the Episcopal Church. Now, I grew up Lutheran Missouri Synod, and when I became Episcopalian when I was rather young, it wasn't over any kind of social issue like that. I never thought about women ordination or when I sat in the pews as growing up in the Missouri Synod, I never looked up there and looked at the pastor. I never thought to myself, well, why isn't it a woman up there? I never thought that way. And then likewise, when I became an Episcopalian, and we had women priests, it was not everywhere was common. I never wondered, why is there a woman up there instead of a man? I never wondered that either. I mean, it was just the way it is. But for both, it's just the way it is. So by default, I wasn't, and I'm still not opposed to women's ordination. I've been blessed to have women colleagues in ordained ministry whom, from my experience, were solid pastoral people. I know that's perhaps not a theological justification for it, but all to say is women's ordination was never really something I was going to die on a hill on one way over another. And then when I dabbled into what certain biblical scholars and theologians had to say on it, and representatives from either side, I'm still not convinced that that there's a justification for male-only priesthood. And we can get into that. That's not really here or there. I'm really interested in hearing your perspective. And and being like that, like I said, that there is an understanding that men and women can share in ministry, yet in distinct ways in your church body. It seems to me your understanding on this matter is different from the type of understanding that Beth Allison Barr fled from, the type of complementarianism, as it's called, that you do find in a lot of conservative American evangelicalism, or at least the part of the SBC, Southern Baptist Convention, that Barr described her disillusionment with. I think confessional Lutherans or the Roman Catholic Church are examples of church bodies that have an understanding that men and women share in the ministry of the gospel, yet in different ways. They base their understandings, though, on something that is different from the type of perhaps rigid and excessive forms of maybe gender role assignments or type of more extreme subjugation of women that you will find in parts of American evangelicalism. So help me with the nuance involved here, because I think a lot of our secular culture just looks from the outside and see, oh, Catholics, Baptists, Missouri Synod, they all have just male pastors. It's all just because they're sexist or whatever.
That's not true, Drew. They don't know who we are, so they're not saying. They're just saying they're Baptists. They don't even. Yeah, you're right. They don't even know those. They don't even know those labels, right? But they just see all Christians as this just amalgamation of sexist people or something. But there's nuance involved here, because it's like, am I right to say that you would not have like subscribed to the type of thing, the Christianity that Beth Barr fled from? You would not have subscribed to that type of complementarianism, right? Or the way it was, at least, what turned.
Yeah. I mean, the complementarian egalitarian categories are categories that are imported from Wayne Grudem and John Piper. I mean, they're completely made up categories that evangelicals have just, have been drinking so deeply from that. They've just assumed those two categories and that either or. And I think Bethany and I both would say I kind of reject those categories pretty much entirely, because, and some of that stems from having different understandings of the office of the ministry, and as opposed to seeing it as a leadership role, which is sort of what often happens within evangelicalism when you get these conversations about women serving in the office of the ministry. Is it's like we look in the Bible and you see women in leadership roles, and it's like, well, there you go. You can have female pastors because women were leading. And it's like, yeah, but I think our response would be, but they're not in the office of the ministry. They're not in the office of the pastor. And whereas if you're in a ecclesiastical setting that has kind of collapsed all of those distinctions, you see the person who's in charge, that's the pastor. And if that can't be a woman, it has to be a man. It's then everybody else comes in line behind his authority as the boss. And so kind of building systems in terms of, who's in charge in the room, and or if we're all just egalitarians versus, for Lutherans, it's who has the office of the proclamation of the gospel and the administration of the sacraments. We're not really asking who's in charge so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess one thing I would just kind of throw in there too, just in terms of kind of mutual understanding. I think the first thing you said, Drew, and I just took a couple notes on it, was that there's this view that perhaps confessional Lutherans have that women are somehow not quote, fit or designed for the office of the ministry, which is actually not a view that we would hold. There might be some people who do hold that, unfortunately, in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, but that's actually not our view. Women are fit in the sense of, like you say, functionally, very fine people. Pastorally speaking, I know I've personally been blessed a great deal by close friendships with female pastors. So that's certainly not at issue to us, to go back to what Ellie had said, is there a specific calling that we can look to for a divinely ordained office of the ministry, and with less seen in a role of kind of leadership and authority, and more in terms of some other functions, which to get back to the book, I guess, is why, if you're coming at it from our perspective, a lot of the argument, I look at it and I say, you're totally right. Like, I don't disagree with hardly any of this, but it's also moot, I guess. So yes, all of the stuff with Phoebe and Junia as an apostle, yes, love it, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Love it, right? But the distinction is that there's people who are leaders, but haven't necessarily, to our understanding, been called to that particular role. So she makes a lot of hay of, for example, the fact that Mary Magdalene, really important figure, right? And actually, after the book was published, there was an article by somebody else that she spent a lot of time interacting with on Twitter about perhaps there was some messing around going on with manuscripts of the Gospel of John, where Mary Magdalene got edited out and they put in Martha. And I was like, that's interesting. I mean, I don't know. But the point is, actually, from my perspective, the more importance you put on those figures, the more it actually disproves her case. Because I would say, well, clearly Jesus was no misogynist. He didn't think that women were unfit or not designed for anything. And yet we'd go back and look at the call of the 12 apostles and say, well, here's somebody who was very in their circle, Mary Magdalene. And yet how weird that she wasn't called in that way. So to a degree, some of the arguments, they're interesting, but because she has a functionalist view of the ministry as a Baptist, and because we don't, and Roman Catholics don't either, right? It's a little bit beside the point. So, I mean, I think when you see the Southern Baptist Convention and others barring women from the office of ministry, it's for different reasons than how we would think of that.
Mm-hmm. Now, so because you say the Lutheran understanding is different from a mere functional view of ordained, the call ordained office, but it's definitely not the Catholic view, though, or the Roman Catholic view, which is, from what I understand, very ontological, sacrificial nature of the priesthood. So kind of tell, what is the confessional Lutheran understanding of the office of ordained ministry?
Well, I can say a little bit of the Roman Catholic view. I'll leave that up to Ellie. I mean, I do want to just really highlight the fact, okay, before we get blowback on the internet, which is going to happen, okay, that we are not theologians or public teachers of the church and are not holding ourselves up as such in that manner. But if you look, historically at the development of ideas of ordination and things like this, the view that Rome has now comes out of the North African tradition in particular, back in the patristic period. And they do have a view that ordination will leave an indelible ontological mark on an individual, and that women are therefore ontologically incapable of receiving this mark, right? Mm-hmm. So there is an ontology issue there, which there's been, I haven't read it, but a recent book, I think it's called like Icons of Christ, maybe something. Is that it? And it goes into the situation, well, how do we, what are the implications of that now that I think virtually everybody would hold, although not some out there are a few, but most people would hold that women and men are ontologically equal. What difference does this make then in terms of that belief? But in any case, that would be the Roman Catholic view. I could say something about the Lutheran view, but I'll maybe punt off to Ellie saying that's the Roman Catholic view of it.
Yeah, and Lutherans is not so much magic ordination powers, more approval, intermediate call by another body to the office of the ministry, and that's the what's the word I'm reaching for? My mind just went.
So yeah, I mean, so it's not the case that there's an ontological difference, but the case is that rather than something, inside of you changing, it's that God's word has put you into a specific office. And there's been some debate in Lutheran history over whether that is, does that take place via the call of pastors in some kind of, you can think about that in different ways, apostolic succession of doctrine, and then the pastors are, doing this, or to what extent, or is it just the congregation who issues the call, which then through that word, it puts the person into a specific office, right? So the emphasis, and I'm probably echoing my husband a little bit here, is much more for Lutherans on the external word than through the congregation, or probably just other members of the pastor, the ordained pastorate, calling somebody into this specific role, which Jesus has then called some men who are called to this too, and not most men, obviously, like the vast majority, the vast majority. But the emphasis would be there, as opposed to then via ordination, there's a change somehow in the character of the person, which does not dissipate, right? Even if you are defrocked or something, you still would bear the indelible mark of the priesthood. You would just not be able to confect the office, the sacrifice of the Mass anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, so, our denomination calls through congregations, but we have complete fellowship with other denominations that have, more of an episcopacy and have bishops and such. And so, they have their kind of ordination process that, works that way. And we're kind of like, the point is, as Bethany noted, is the calling through, the external word.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to sort of much more of a functionalist view, like Beth Allison Barr, where you're kind of the one who's in charge and has decided that you're going to be the person that's going to preach and lead the Bible study and whatever, and folks that are there like, okay, that works for us.
So I mean, I would just to kind of pick up on that, to get back to some of what she says about, I think these are by far, I don't want to, I think this is a really good book. I do have, I think I would like people to read it. I do have some reservations, obviously, but I don't want to make it seem too much like I have all these criticisms or something good to say here. But I would say one concern that I think both of us had reading it was that, and she is a specialist in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, but she's also somebody who is a Baptist, right, and lives in a ministerial household, and that then there is this, I wouldn't even say latent, this maybe explicit activist component to the work, and that I think maybe as a result of that, she's reading some of her own Baptist ecclesiology back into the Middle Ages and early modern period when she's talking about these figures. And so she'll say things about, Genevieve or Hildegard Clinton or people like this, and about, they're basically acting as priests or bishops, or one was even accidentally ordained.
Was it Bridget who was accidentally ordained?
I was like, what? That's very strange. But the point, and so, therefore, well, okay, but the point is that it's not so much, look what people did in the past, and so they can do it in the present. Well, no, in the past, they wouldn't, nobody had a confusion here. They would have said, well, even if somebody was somehow accidentally ordained, it didn't take, because you were not ontologically capable of bearing this indelible mark. So there's, I think, kind of reading back into it. I mean,
Hildegard would never have thought of herself as a priest, and she would never have been, serving at Mass, and that would have been a clear line for her. I don't think you can argue historically that, she was de facto a priest because of her work in the church.
Well,
unless you're a Baptist.
Okay, right. So, so that's the other thing, is that there's this conflation of, preaching, right, with then the ordained ministry. And if you're perhaps a Baptist, this works, right? But if you are Roman Catholic or if you are a confessional Lutheran, it doesn't work because there's other stuff going on here. And like we would say, anybody can preach, right? In the sense of the mutual consolation of the brethren, right? So you can certainly preach the gospel in that sense to your friends, colleagues, other people, all of that, but that's not the same as having a public call to the office of the ministry. So is Hildegard doing that? Yeah. But is she doing the other thing? No. And I think one thing that you see in here, perhaps, is that women do have, I think, more freedom in some ways in the Middle Ages than they might in modern. I'm not a Baptist. I shouldn't maybe put words into their mouth, but in perhaps present day, some evangelical Baptist circles, to do more public roles and things like this in leadership positions. And I would argue that's because there's a really clear line. There's no worry that somehow anybody would mistake what these women are doing for the office of the priesthood, right? And so therefore, there's actually a lot more freedom to do things. And so when you get into periods, I would say like right now, actually, where there's a lot more fear about the possibility of loosey-goosey gender stuff or mixing or things like this, then that's actually going to cause people to draw harder lines and to try and maintain some level of purity. This is like Mary Douglas, right?
Yeah, the modern culture wars.
Yeah,
the modern culture wars complicate things in ways
right.
that the medieval content. Yeah, I hear you. So one of the things from Barr's book, and I agreed with a significant amount of the things she had to say, but also like when you get into argumentative literature, especially like popular argumentative literature, that's criticizing and combating a certain viewpoint that they're trying to persuade you is a no-go. Straw mans do tend to come out, right? And not just straw mans, but even like sloppy arguments. I found a lot of what she said in the first chapter, and I enjoyed significant portions of the rest of the book, but it was that first chapter that was really for me, to get through that, at least. I feel like I kept finding straw man arguments and just not good argumentation. And one was and you see this everywhere, was maybe I shouldn't bring this up because I don't like getting like too socio-political-ish, but was the gender wage gap. That in comparison to men.
I remember her writing about that.
I don't remember that.
Clearly, it just blew past me.
Oh, it's in the first chapter. Yeah, well, and it was
almost 2 years ago we wrote this review. Like Bethany and I were talking the other night. I was like, I have to remember what we even wrote.
Well, see, I should have got you all on 2 years ago. Would have you're very relevant right now. But like. She talks about the wage gap and like in comparison to men, women only make it's the familiar talking point we hear a lot. The 70 cents on the man's dollar. And that of course is not really stood up under scrutiny. I mean, if you're just taking all median salaries from everywhere, not factoring a whole bunch of other factors like different fields and how you see the general tendency in the overall workforce that often men and women are attracted to different things, that shouldn't be controversial. It's an observation, but it is kind of, I guess, to bring that up, and I guess we can have initiatives to try to change that, but like people are going to do what they're drawn to do. And dare we say, not all that's environmental. Part of that could be biological, but anyways, like I said, things that shouldn't be controversial, but they are. I remember like when I was in college, my minor was in youth services, and I remember in the tech, which was mainly entailed like social work classes. And I remember in like one of these and this is a mainstream textbook at the state university that I went to. It talked about how to work with children that were had been abused or had gone through trauma. And it recommended these are kind of different ways you have to address it with a little girl as opposed to a little boy, right? It was just like a given fact, right? Because, and not there's exceptions, but there are kind of general tendencies you can see in the way that the kids of the different biological sexes can take to care for them. So, but anyways,
I don't know. I just found that kind of problematic, but also like another part in that first chapter that I just found kind of problematic was that she went to make an argument that I don't know. I guess she, and again, I know you guys don't, or you gals, sorry, don't even buy the
These guys, we're guys.
whatever. Y'all, I should say.
I've been called way worse.
I should keep to my southern y'all. I know you even have like issues with the categories of patriarchy and complementarianism, but she kind of makes an argument saying they're basically the same things, and it really seemed sweeping to me, some of the arguments I found, especially in the first chapter. And it didn't get into like that there are different shades to these concepts, right? Like I found like in Michael Bird, the biblical scholar, the evangelical biblical scholar, who I found him sort of a lot more helpful on this. He gives a full chart in his book, Bourgeois Babes, Bossy Wives, and Bobby Haircuts, which, by the way, it's a book where he argues his stance in that of the, egalitarian position of men and women in equal ministry, which is, the stance I hold. But he in doing so, he was like more careful. Like he didn't vilify complementarianism, and notes that there are shades to it. You can have what he would call moderate complementarian, where women are encouraged to engage in certain types of ministries, in contrast to hierarchical complementarianism, where their women are prohibited from types of ministries that violate things that they read. Paul is that they claim Paul speaks to, that is instated by God in the order's creation. But I'm just saying, like, it didn't seem like there were any of those distinctions in Barr's work. And for maybe, to be fair, Barr may not just see that as a real distinction, but it just seemed sweeping overall, and not really it didn't really seek to understand something on its own grounds before being critical of it. I don't know if you found straw men as well or anything like that. I don't know. I mean, that's kind of what I found in it, though. But
yeah, I haven't read Bird's book. I actually have that book, but I have not yet read it.
It's a very short read.
Yeah. But I'm familiar with some of his work on this, and have actually, found him much more nuanced. I mean, I think Barr's reacting to a lot in the book, and the book is kind of her processing and reacting to a lot of things. And, I don't want to overanalyze kind of where she was at, but as we all know, sometimes when you have a negative experience with something, it becomes the lens through which you see everything. And there is certainly this element of like, everything is patriarchy. And so, kind of this constant reacting to seeing everything as patriarchy, and that, that can certainly get a bit overblown. There's I suppose room to talk about a spectrum of complementarianism, because honestly, when you say complementarian, different people mean different things.
Right. I see, like,
and it's really important to define those terms.
And patriarchy too.
Yeah.
A lot within there that
it needs a lot of unpacking. I just don't think she did the unpacking of it.
She probably didn't. And I mean, just as, some people say, egalitarians view, men and women as completely interchangeable and they're exactly the same. And I'm sure there's some egalitarians that think that. And there's some that, would say, no, absolutely. Men and women are distinct and, have different gifts and abilities and different tendencies and everything else, and would have no problem conceding that. And so I'm wondering if there's a little bit more middle ground there than there's more of a Venn diagram there, perhaps, than people appreciate. Again, my rejection of kind of both of these is kind of distinct categories. I think that there's probably room for them to interact with each other a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, she definitely, I think probably, especially at this point, would see kind of anything on that spectrum of patriarchy, on spectrum of complementarianism as absolutely patriarchy and absolutely wrong. And, I think would see the goal as moving much more towards an pure egalitarianism, and however we can do that. I think she would see that as laudable, however she would want to define that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to something we were talking about on the phone yesterday, Ellie, which is that, and I mean, I want to be, again, absolutely respectful to Dr. Barr and her position and everything, but it does seem like, from an outsider perspective, I mean, she's really public on social media. Like she tweets a lot, and so compared to where she was with the book, if you kind of go across time to now, she does seem to, from my perspective at least, have become much more strident in terms of her just the complete rejection of anybody who she would consider to be quote unquote complementarian, which I know she would put me into that category, even though I would reject it for myself. But and anybody who does not think women's ordination is possible, which I would put myself in that category, as automatically participating either wittingly or unwittingly, perhaps living under this false consciousness, contributing to the subjugation of women, right, in this way. And so I do think that might actually hurt her position in some ways, because I think that there are a lot of good takeaways here. But if you're going to really push that hard against these perceived enemies, people are going to miss any of the good kind of nuances and things they can take out of the book with some discernment. I do just want to say, though, speaking of straw men, a couple things in the book, though, towards the end, and again, Ellie and I talked about this last night, the inerrancy part I thought was pretty problematic from at least a confessional Lutheran perspective. And I would say that I think, again, I'm not, I mean, maybe you can speak this better than me, Ellie, but I don't think this is, or I guess I think this is probably maybe the typical evangelical Baptist view of the inerrancy, but it's really not the confessional Lutheran view. It might be in the pews, but really it shouldn't be, which is that, the Bible is inerrant, right? And so therefore you build all of your beliefs on that. And so then if you discover, lo and behold, Paul was wrong about what he said about women, or not wrong, but we've been misinterpreting it and we're using these passages as sticks to beat people with the stick of inerrancy, right? That then all your whole belief system collapses, right? And so inerrancy has been used to kind of keep women down. In terms of the term inerrancy, as we would understand it, right? It's more the case that it's like the icing on the cake, so we believe in Jesus by virtue of his resurrection and being called to the faith through the Holy Spirit. And then Jesus affirms the Holy Scripture. And so therefore we believe it must be inerrant, right? But it's kind of in reverse, right? So she's arguing against a position that isn't necessarily one everybody associates with the word inerrancy. And I get that it's used differently in different contexts. But I don't know, Amy, what
yeah, well, and I think she's arguing against, sometimes people think that the interpretation is inerrant and have kind of enshrined a particular interpretation of a text as the inerrant interpretation of the text. And so she's reacting against a lot of that as well. Is like, well, if I don't think this interpretation is correct, then I must not think inerrancy is correct. And she kind of does some historical dancing around that, but it's like, as Bethany said, there's different ways of understanding inerrancy. And if you start with Jesus, and it's true because he rose from the dead and we trust him in his word, and that's your starting place. And then that gives you some freedom to kind of wrestle with the text, as opposed to, it's a caricature, but a drop down out of the sky and this is absolutely what it says. And there's often this view of wanting to kind of treat the scriptures like you're the first person sitting there reading it by yourself, and as opposed to reading it in communion with the saints that have gone before us in the church that we're engaged in now, and having a community kind of reading of the text and wrestling with it with each other. That is not if you're asking questions about the interpretation, that itself is not a questioning of inerrancy. Whereas I think she kind of seems to assume that.
Good point. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah. So one big hang up when you turn to Barth, and this does involve, your church body's understanding, turning to Barth's historical treatment. Something you pointed out in your review of her historical treatment. And again, I mean, like you both said, Barr is an excellent historian and medievalist in many rights. I remember years ago, her contribution to the book, Martin Luther in Context, which I rented. I don't own it. So I wish I had it. I could pull it out because I couldn't find the article online, but she contributed a chapter about Luther and St. Anne, of course, St. Anne being the, who Luther prayed to during the thunderstorm. And have any of you read that article?
No, I haven't.
It's been a while, but it's in the book, Martin Luther in Context. But it was, I found at the time, at least when I read it, really great. I mean, I've done more theological study since, and I'd have to look back at it to see, if it, kind of stands up to what other voices I've, heard from has said about either Luther's development or whatever. But anyway, on the topic of Luther, and it wouldn't be a Doth Protest episode if Luther was not at least mentioned. It's kind of inevitable. He's one of our mascots. I'm cramming around the cover of the podcast art if you didn't see it. But Barr in this book speaks, she devotes, I think, an entire chapter to the Reformation.
Mm-hmm. Right. That was a good chapter.
Its effect on women. Sorry?
I thought that was a really good chapter.
Okay, yeah.
I thought, that one and the one in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, what are the strengths of it before we get into what I found in your review as your hang up about it with Luther? What were the strengths of the Reformation chapter for that?
Well, I think it brings up things that, I will say one thing, as a historian, there wasn't really, aside from some very specific stuff about the English Middle Ages and John Merck and sermons, and I know she specializes in this, there wasn't anything new to me in the book, right? So It's stuff.
That tends to be what happens with popular books. Once you, I know all this, I know all this, I know all this. Like, you feel like you're wasting your time.
I mean, what she did a really good job of bringing different streams of stuff together, in a way that was still scholarly, right? And maybe could give it a new interpretation and then make it accessible to people. And that's an incredible accomplishment. I don't want to in any way belittle that. But having said that, some things that I liked about it was that she brought out for people that, the Reformation actually wasn't all good for women in a lot of ways. In some ways, women did have more, today we might talk about it as career, but more vocation options in the Middle Ages. And as a result of some factors in the Reformation, we do get what she's talking about as biblical womanhood, which is this kind of cult of domesticity that arises after the Reformation. I think she has a line where she talks about, and I think we quoted in the review, where she talks about how for women, the priest is replaced by the husband in the household or something like that. And so the place of the woman becomes, which as a pious Christian woman, is to be the spouse bearing children, which is a wonderful vocation. Again, we're both mothers, so neither of us obviously would want to in any way belittle that either. But it does narrow the field a little bit in terms of various monastic options or things like this for women. So she does do a good job of bringing that out, that women's roles are to a degree somewhat narrowed at that point, and that's the beginning of this, she calls it the Protestant cult of domesticity, that is just increased with industrial and economic changes that are happening, changes in the economy, which brings people from working, the man is increasingly working outside and the women are working more in the home, as opposed to some more traditional economic systems, and these are more separated, right? And this combines with the emphasis on the wife as the woman as the wife and the mother, and that's the pious ideal, and we get this cult of domesticity, right? So she does a good job showing the historical roots of that, going back to the Reformation.
Yeah.
So I have no.
Well, I want to pick up on that note in in the next in a moment, because as far as the modern era and the industrial and post-industrial period, and how much that how much we don't even realize we're conditioned by that. But you did mention in your review, I'll just quote it: Luther's view on women is more complicated than Barr allows for, unquote. What does Barr say about Luther, and what is it, do you think, that her work was missing in that?
I don't actually remember what she said about Luther, but I'm going to take a guess. Do you remember exactly what she said about Luther?
I think I do remember what we're saying she said about Luther. So I can.
Okay. I'm really sorry.
Why don't you do you, and then I'll do me, and then we'll see what we come up with.
Well, yeah, I'm going to guess that. I feel bad because I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I'm going to guess that We're
sorry, Beth Allison Barr, if you hear this.
I'm sure she's not going to hear this. I'm sure she has better things to do. But often people tend to either, Luther, the raging misogynist, or Luther, the complete liberator of all things and all women and everything else. And he tends to kind of live in these two polar opposites. And he's kind of all over the place on a lot of things. And he's kind of all over the place with women. He's written some wonderful, amazing things about women. And he's written some things about women. It's like, really? Come on, dude.
That applies to a lot that Luther wrote in a lot of times.
Exactly. I mean,
Luther. Yeah.
I mean, you can read him on ecclesiology, and sometimes he sounds like, a house church Baptist, and there's other times he sounds like, he sounds thoroughly Catholic, and it depends on who he's interacting with. It depends on what he's reacting to. It depends on the year. The year is really important.
Right.
Yeah.
Does he have gout? Does he not have gout? Right.
Yeah. Right. Is his tinnitus acting up?
Right. You don't know.
Right. Kidney stones today.
Right. And that's so true. I mean, and Lutherans will be the first to contend, if they're a good Lutheran, that Luther is not the Pope. He's not an infallible source of and he's as we've pointed out on this podcast, his theology usually meets the occasion, right? He's as he's been called, the occasionalist theologian. And so, and there is a development, like it is for all the great thinkers of any era. There's a development of thought. I mean, are we talking about 1520, 1530? But you cited in your review a dissertation I'm really interested in reading. I don't know how to pronounce this person's name. Her name's Sini Mikola. The title's In Our Body. In Our Body, the Scripture Becomes Fulfilled, a gendered bodiliness and the Making of the Gender System in Martin Luther's Anthropology from 1520 to 1530. That sounded really fascinating, I guess, out of the Helsinki, the University of Helsinki.
There's interesting stuff in there. So I'm what I was at least complaining about there, I guess you guys are grousing about, was like Ellie said, so there tends to be either Luther is the great, liberator of women, to look at this great relationship he had with his wife. And that tends to be, so which I guess why I was like, this is a great chapter, because that tends to be what we do here in, Lutheran circles, is you want to obviously present him in a good light and, by our standards today. On the other hand, right, you just have all this other stuff. And so she does tend to focus in more on Luther, who for sure is, women, he's a person of his times. Like, I'm pretty sure we say in there, right? He for sure is going to say women are not, ontologically equal. They're, and says things that are frankly offensive to us today. And, I would, think we would, for the most part, not be on board with. So she does tend to give us a little bit more of that Luther. Having said that, there's also more of Luther going on there. And I think the idea that my impression was that she does tend to, she's talking about, for Luther, the women, they're really reduced to their childbearing functions and things like this. Okay, fair enough. And some sexual components. But, Luther also talks a lot about, or not maybe a lot, but in different places, according to some of this research, about the importance of men and about men's sexuality and holiness and things like this, about this too, post-marriage. So you don't quite get some of that nuance in talking about him either, that it's not just that he is somehow reducing women to their kind of childbearing capacity and things like this. He has some broader things to say that there hasn't been a lot, I think, of work done on some of those areas. But yeah, so that, I guess, would have been my major critique, was that she's really honing in on the one side, which is not necessarily terrible, because our side maybe hones in on the other side too much. And so we need to hear that side. But at the same time, in the interest of giving a fuller picture of Luther, we do want to integrate those two and understand that there was development, especially after his marriage. And that there's a big difference between, which for all of us, right, what we say in theory sometimes and how we live out things in practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the guy, I think, literally never had a thought that he didn't write down.
Oh, for sure.
So,
yeah.
I mean,
that's why they're still translating them. Yeah.
Yeah, they're still translating. Exactly. But I think that chapter is helpful as Lutherans, certainly, because, as Bethany noted, we tend to put that all in kind of very luminous light and think that everything was always awesome about every single aspect of the Reformation, and to look at it in terms of how the Reformation impacted women and how it impacted women's communities. I know she had a thing in there too that I thought was really interesting about how women lost their communities within each other because they were confined to the household now. So they were spending less time with other women and having those opportunities to have those friendships and that kind of support. And which of course changes your well-being and changes a whole lot of other things in terms of how you interact with the world and where you get support from. Which was, the comment about, Katie dying completely impoverished is, she's now kind of stripped of, now that she doesn't have a husband, stripped of, any opportunity to kind of participate in the marketplace economically and to gain some advantage, even though we know that she was a woman that was fairly skilled at running this household and kind of trying to keep everything afloat, even though dear Martin wanted to give everything away all the time.
Yeah. I want to thank you both for being on. I had one, I think this would be a good closing question. And it's related to everything the last couple things we've discussed. You mentioned that, quote, Barr's work could benefit from greater attention to class analysis and the class-bound nature of the cult of domesticity. What can you kind of expand on that? Like what if we did explore that, or if she would have explored that, like what are some great, not findings, but just why is it useful to be mindful of that? Because the book didn't really touch on that, but there's, I guess how, I think it'd be a good note to end on. Like what about that do you think would be very helpful in exploring? Because like you said, like going into the modern period and then with industrialization, I think Bethany mentioned that traditional economies faded out, and where you perhaps saw more interchange of men and women doing. There's a lot of overlap between what men and women did. Men, of course, still doing specific things as opposed to specific things women did, but it was just a different time. And so it's really the modern, the domestication, I guess, was brought on by so much of the modern period. So yeah, I want to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I wrote that line because I'm the modern.
That's Bethany's area.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I know actually what I was thinking was, and this is not so much a critique of her as it is like, wouldn't it be interesting if we could expand some of this into maybe a further project or something different, right? So I guess my thought was just, it would be interesting to think more about how class played into the development of this ideal of biblical womanhood, which really is more of a middle class thing, right? Because like I think I said, if you're, working class, and at least, but again, we're both primarily British historians. So if you're in that context, if you're a working class person in like circa 1890, right? You're not, you have to go work, right? You don't have enough money to possibly. Now, the ideal is to be able to be home, right? Because that's the ideal of respectability, but not everybody can like manage that, and they have to scrimp by in some way. And so I just wonder, if we follow that through into today, what does that, if we were to do today some kind of a more class analysis, looking at the evangelical cult of biblical womanhood, would we find that this is more appealing among middle-class women, upper-class women,
right.
Middle upper-class women, just because they have the capacity to make this kind of thing work? To stay,
Yep.
You think about it, like who can stay home these days to make this thing work? And if you can't, there's all this tension in your life, right? That you're not living up to this biblical ideal of womanhood, which is not to be out working, not to, doing the stuff, be staying home, raising kids, which again, wonderful vocation, but that's an ideal. And if you're working class, then you can't do that necessarily, right? Because if you're wealthy, you've got to go and work. So does that mean, do we have then this rejection of these evangelical ideals about biblical womanhood? I mean, so another thing you could think about, and I'm not sure, I mean, it'd be interesting to look into somehow, look at the fall in, and maybe it's not, I don't know enough about American history to be able to say, but the rates of church participation among working class people is really low. I mean, people oftentimes think it's, the upper class, upper middle class people who are the ones who don't go to church, or people with more education. That's not true. People with more education and more money tend to have higher rates, for the most part, of church attendance and belief than it's people who are lower class, lower education who don't.
And they're probably working on Sunday morning.
They're working on Sunday morning. Yeah.
They're working, But I mean, is part of this that then you look at some of these ideals surrounding gender that are being sold and promoted in evangelical churches, then is that just not appealing, right? Are people just not buying it?
Right.
I guess I think one good thing that this book does that I would really want to maybe emphasize with as we close out is that it says to people, including in our own church body, who are importing these ideas, which I would argue are not confessionally Lutheran or biblical for that matter, that, don't let that be a reason to keep yourself away from Christ and from his church, right? Is that, you don't have, there's not this ideal that you somehow have to be able to meet. This is a man-made construct, right? And I think she does a good job of showing the history of that, and getting out word of that, I think, is certainly a good thing that she has done, despite the differences, the theological differences that we would have, and some of the critiques that we would have, and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, I often say Jesus makes us all different, and that's no less true of women. There's a tendency to kind of cookie cutter women and kind of lock them into this idea of, kind of ideal womanhood. And she certainly allows that freedom of, exploring that. What are your gifts? Where do you want to contribute? How do you want to contribute? Zero wrong saying, you know what, I want to stay home and raise my kids. And, and I think, Bethany and I certainly would have nothing negative to say about that. But there's a switch that happens. There's a switch that happens when that becomes a mandate.
Right, exactly.
And then there are people that are needlessly burdened, either because they can't manage that financially, and they have an expectation that the Lord will just provide somehow. And so then there's this wrestling with the Lord's provision to be able to do that, or women who are just not cut out to stay home all day every day. And benefit from having things to do outside the home. I mean, again, we're all individual adult humans and interact with our vocations differently, and it's okay to do that in a way that doesn't harm our neighbors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Women are in fact humans, right? The same to know, and
right.
Picture of that position.
Whatever blowback on this episode, whatever people want to say, we can all agree women are humans.
You'd be surprised.
Drew.
I may be surprised, but
that will be the line right there. It's going to be, somebody's going to quote things, and then it's gonna blow up all
It's
over.
gonna go
We'll just-
downhill
we'll
from
just
there.
throw Dorothy Sayers at 'em.
outrageous!
Yeah,
Like,
right, exactly. Just it's Dorothy Sayers.
Yeah, Dorothy Sayers, that raging feminist.
we had a Dorothy Sayers scholar on 2
Oh.
episodes ago, but she came on and talked about C.S. Lewis. But the next time we get her on, Susan Bray, that's a sign. That's a sign from God. I'm not trying
Dorothy Sayers is my girl. She's amazing.
I mean, I mostly just like the mysteries. I'm not gonna lie. I've got a thing for British detective fiction, but also other good stuff she did.
Yeah, her sequence of plays on the life of Christ are remarkable.
I've not read
amazing.
those.
They are amazing.
Okay.
They're really beautiful.
I have not read like any Dorothy Sayers, so I really have to. If I'm going to do that episode, I'm going to have to do a lot of homework. So, but it sounds like fun homework for that. So
It is fun homework.
That was a weird sidetrack. Sorry.
No, it wasn't. No, it's all good. Ellie and Bethany, thank you so much. In our show notes, we'll put y'all's review of The Making of Biblical Womanhood by Beth Barr. We'll put a link to the book. We'll put a link to y'all's review, as well as a link to Lutheran Women on the Road, the Substack that Bethany and Ellie both regularly contribute to. And so thank you so much for your time, and God bless. And for our listeners, we look forward to having you tune in again.